Hello and welcome to Season 3, Episode 39 of Logicast, the AWS News podcast brought to you by Logicata. I'm Karl Robinson, CEO and co-founder of Logicata, and I'm joined today, as always, by my ever-faithful soldier and co-host, John Goodall. How are you doing today, John?
You should have called me a soft furnishings aficionado, because now I have cushions in shot and everything.
You are showing off your cushions today. I don't think I've ever seen cushions in shot before. I apologise to anyone who's only listening to the podcast and is not viewing the video recording. But John does seem to have a rather fetching cushion, which I believe has been brought deliberately into the shot as some kind of accessory.
It just sort of sits here on my sofa because I'm bougie enough that I have a sofa for doing podcast recordings separate from my desk because I'm posh like that. But the camera moves around on a tripod because it's not here all the time. So it's just slightly different angle, I think.
So is the sofa only used for podcast recordings or does it have another purpose as well?
I mean, arguably every sofa has multiple purposes because sitting and sleeping and all the rest of it. But I sometimes sit here and have a coffee when I'm thinking about something, and the cat uses it quite a lot. Both of them do.
Well, there we go. Multi-purpose sofa and branded cushions were discussed. I do know a friend who makes cushions. We'll have to get some branded Logicata fabric or Logicast fabric to get some branded cushions made up to get those in shot. Anyway, we're waffling on about sofas and cushions. Not really what we're here to talk about. We have been joined today by a very special guest, fellow AWS Community Builder, Mohammed Rashid. How are you doing today, Mohammed?
Yeah, I'm doing well. Thank you for this invite, and so
no worries. Great to have you along.
Yeah.
Tell us a bit about what you do for a living, where you come from, etc. What you do for the AWS community.
Yeah, since this is my first year on AWS as a community builder. So because I have joined because I was working on YouTube and LinkedIn articles writing about AWS dev tools mostly. So that's why I was invited and become the AWS community builder. So this is how I think it's a 1 year journey in AWS.
Cool. And what about what you do for a living when you're not being a community builder?
Yeah. I normally, I think since 5-6 years, I'm doing freelance and remote work for different countries' clients, software development, mostly in backend, DevOps, and web and mobile applications because of experience. And I'm just doing remote work from home. So the effect is I have not joined any office since my study. So I started the freelance since my education. So that's why I'm mature and have a lot of network, and I get clients from Upwork, but majorly on LinkedIn and my YouTube channel. So this is how my journey about the work, except AWS side.
So I guess we would call you a remote working native, having never worked in an office in your life.
Yeah.
I think I've just made that phrase up. I've never, obviously I've heard the term cloud native, but yeah, actually it's quite interesting because you're not the first person that we've had on the podcast that's never actually worked in an office. And I find that, we're a fully remote business as well at Logicata. So we don't have an office. We have a registered office and occasionally we meet clients in their rented meeting rooms there. But we don't have an office as a business. We've got people dotted around the world, but that's a relatively recent thing. Most of my career prior to this was either office-based or hybrid working. So, some working from home, some working in an office. So I find it absolutely fascinating that, there's a lot of people out there in the world now who've never, ever actually worked in an office. Are you okay with that? Or do you feel that maybe you've missed something by not doing that? I mean, I don't miss it now because I've been there, done that, and I'm quite happy with remote working. But I'm just curious from your perspective, Mohammed, whether you'd maybe like to work in an office one day, or you're happy doing what you're doing. Or?
I think that's very a complex questions. Why? Because based on the location I am here, the reason is that it depends upon how you are getting the value of your work. So in my country, based on my experience, if I join any office, I have a lot of invitations, but I have not joined it because that's not worth to me. Maybe if I'm in a different locations, maybe in US, yeah, but of course I can have to some office to see how it work, how a different environment. Sometimes I think about it, like sometimes you get boring, sitting and working, and when you are free, okay, that's something comes mind. But on other side, then you think, if you going to office, it should be perfect, that's why I'm thinking about going, an upcoming event on AWS and US. So yeah, there is a little wish to do this, works in office.
Yeah, I think social interaction is important, but you can get that in other ways. So, there's lots of conferences, AWS user groups, that kind of thing. A little plug coming up. Obviously, John and I run the AWS Brighton user group. Our next meetup is in 2 days' time on Thursday, the 14th of November, where hopefully we're going to be running an AWS Jam event, one of the first community-led AWS Jam events, if we can get it to work. Still got 2 days to get it to work. So, yeah, I mean, there are lots of ways to get that social interaction which don't require you to go to an office. But I just think it's fascinating that there are people like yourself, Mohammed, who are educated, who are certified, but who've never worked in an office. It's just, for somebody of my generation, that's just kind of a strange concept, really. But I guess that's the way the world is nowadays. My last office job, I only really went there on the days when there was free food, usually on a Friday. That was the only reason to go there. They're taking us out for lunch, or they're getting a takeaway into the office. Yeah, let's go to the office and get some free food, which wasn't really free because I had a 60-mile each way commute. And by the time I paid for the fuel for that, I might as well have just bought my own food. But yeah, it was nice to go in and interact with people. Anyway, we're not here to talk about remote working and office-based
that's a
employment.
very different podcast.
Yeah, we could go on for half an hour about that. I'm sure we've already gone on for a fair while about that. But we are here, of course, to talk about AWS news. So regular listeners to the podcast will know that once a week, I curate a list of AWS news, which I share via my weekly AWS News Roundup newsletter. And then John and I pick a set of articles that we'd like to talk about with our guests. So we do, of course, have such a set of articles this week. And the first one is a new feature announcement for AWS Lambda. And this is the title of the article is that AWS enhances the Lambda application building experience with VS Code IDE and AWS Toolkit. So I've heard people getting fairly excited about these new features for AWS Lambda. And of course, John, you are a serverless community builder. So I'm expecting you to be able to wax lyrical about these new features. I'm not sure if you've had a chance to actually play with it yet, but yeah, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I haven't played with this, and I won't, because I'm not a VS Code user primarily. I'm bougie enough, and I use IntelliJ like a normal person. I don't use VS Code. Flame more in the comments incoming. So no, this isn't something I've used, but I played with these sorts of things before. So the short version here is Lambdas, when you deploy them, you have to package them up first. And depending on the language that you're using, that can be a bit of a faff. So if you're using Python, it's pretty easy. You just zip it up and upload it and off it goes. If you're using say, the Node.js runtime, and you could be writing that in JavaScript or TypeScript or whatever, you have to transpile that down to the relevant kind of runtime environment and then package it and then upload it. And that's a bit of a faff. There's a number of different ways you can do this with AWS tools. I'm a big fan of SAM personally because it's CloudFormation plus a bit, but you have to kind of know how that works as well. Now, I'm a fan of that because I am an infrastructure guy. I might be serverless as kind of like a special interest, if you like, but for a living and historically, I'm an infrastructure guy. So that just kind of made sense to me because it was kind of a tack on. What this is doing is directly through the AWS Toolkit plugged into VS Code, you can build your applications without leaving your IDE. You don't have to go over to the terminal and kind of run those commands and make sure your templates and stuff are all done. It sort of just works, which is nice. So it's a little short article. It's definitely worth looking into if this is something that you do, and you just have a nice kind of guided experience on how to get going with these, because it can be a bit opaque. Because you think, well, how do I get this Lambda to respond to requests from the internet? Well, I know because I've done it before. You use something like API Gateway or the function URL, and you just kind of write that in your template, and Sam will deal with it for you. If you've never done that before, that's really kind of something of a steep learning curve, and it goes a little bit against but the serverless mantra of run code without thinking about servers. You don't have to think about servers, but you still have to think about all the build process and the packaging and how to expose it to the world, which is, you're not thinking about servers, but you are thinking about bits of your architecture. And arguably you should, but this just makes your life a lot easier because it's baked into your IDE. There's a whole load of samples. Nice.
Cool. Anything to add on this, Mohammed?
Yeah, I think first of all, I think as John said, because I'm user of VS Code IDE all the time, I use this tool, and which is interesting to me because it's when it's come to productivity and testing and deploying the code. If you are making things more easier, okay, then that's the one thing that developers are looking for in the serverless. So that's why they have extensions available in VS Code. Like we have to just install the extension in VS Code IDE, and then we can just use with easier way we can authenticate our AWS account with the CLI, and then you have to just write your code and test it and automatically deploy and do these things. So what I think, like this streamline guided experience that what we get in the VS Code IDE. So using AWS Toolkit, so to process and improve the development process. I think that's very interesting and easy to use, because I'm not much to the serverless because I'm mostly on the dev side, developing application and deploying to the other ECS and Kubernetes. But yes, sometime when I use Lambda, I have to go to the console and test and run the code there. But this feature is interesting to utilize it, and because it's come to side where we say automation, okay, and it's a little term like we can just test it. Even if we have multiple projects, we can just launch multiple VS Code IDs and test the code in a smooth way.
Cool. Sounds good. Sounds like you both like it, and more relevant to you, Mohammed, than it is to John. But on that note, let's move on to
because you don't pay me to play around with serverless, much as I want to.
Well, you still play around with serverless, yeah. Anyway, on that note, let's move along to our second article for this week, which is an article published on dev.to by a former multiple-time guest on the Logicast podcast, Danielle Heberling, who is a serverless hero, I believe, now. She wasn't when she first came on. She was when she came on the second time. So we're not saying that her coming on the Logicast podcast influenced her ability to become a serverless hero, but it may have been a factor. But anyway, Danielle's
clinging
latest
to
post,
that desperately.
Of course I am. She's not the only one either.
No, Johannes was.
She's
as
not
well.
the only one either. Yeah. So there we go. But she's published an article on dev.to, obviously in the serverless arena. And the article title is Ephemeral Jobs Longer Than the Lambda Timeout. So obviously the Lambda timeout is currently 15 minutes. If you've got jobs that are appropriate for Lambda, but going to take longer than 15 minutes, this article explains what you should do. So John, what should you do, according to Danielle? And do you agree with her or not?
Yes, I do, because she's correct. Like, there's just... So the problem statement is you've got an ad hoc job, runs in the background, and it's not waiting. There's not someone waiting for it. It's not a synchronous job. It's not like call and response. So this could be batch processing. This could be some sort of background task. This could be, this is anything that maybe it's something you need to run once in a while manually, but it's something that you don't want to have to stand up a server and sit there with the server running it. And traditionally, that's how you'd have done this. You'd have stood up a server. You'd probably use something like Screen to give you a detached terminal, run the command in there, detach the screen, and let it go and do its thing. That's something I've absolutely done before when you're talking about, say, large database dumps. And obviously you'd use DMS for that in the cloud. But, that's what I've used it for before. Something that's going to take more than the Lambda timeout, something that just needs to run. You could do that in a Lambda, but as Danielle says, this job takes longer than 15 minutes because of what it's doing, arbitrary reasons. So what's the solution? Well, one of the solutions, and this is, again, what I do, is you use ECS using Fargate and the run task command. That basically runs an arbitrary task in ECS using Fargate. So you don't have to stand up servers, which is kind of the point of Fargate. ECS isn't limited to the 15-minute timeout that Lambda is, and it'll sit there and it'll do its thing. You do need to have a cluster, but the cluster That's pretty trivial to set up if you're not doing any capacity provision with EC2. You need a task definition, but again, that's not terribly hard to work out. And then a container, so Docker image, effectively. You trigger off run task, and the example here is pretty simple. It's here's my task definition. I want you to run these subnets. Here are your security groups. You have a public IP. Go do. There's a full kind of instruction guide if you go through, which is pretty good and it all makes sense. And yeah, it just solves this problem. You run the task against the cluster. It does the thing that you need it to do, which I know this all sounds very high level and a bit kind of airy-fairy, but the idea is that this is an incredibly generic solution to a problem that's not uncommon in reality. You can kind of extend this as well to things like cron as well, because rather than standing up a server for running cron tasks, assuming that your cron tasks don't need large amounts of, say, your application sitting next to them in order to work properly, you could just do it like this, event bridge ECS task, because some, scheduled tasks can just take a while. So this is good. I like this. This is, as she says, something that you just need to use occasionally for one-off tasks that take longer than 15 minutes. This is nice. I like this.
Thoughts, Mohammed? Anything to add?
Yeah, I think Adam. I think the problem he told like 15 minutes. If the jobs are bigger, then I think the solution is awesome. Like you instead of Lambda, long running jobs can be executed on demands in a containerized environment on ECS. So with Fargate and where the resources are only charged when the tasks are actively running. And then I think it's very easy to set up. Also, we have to just set it's need ECS cluster, and then we have a task definition and a container, and these components enable a job to run in isolated environment. So that's why I think we can complete when the task is completed, we can stop it, and we can also avoid this ongoing charges, ongoing cost. So I think, this is, I think, the perfect solution. She written the articles. I think that's good. Like if someone want to run, long running jobs, this can be the perfect solution.
Cool. Sounds good. Well, thank you, Danielle, for this solution. And thanks for your opinions, guys. On that note, let's move along to our third article for this week. Call it an article. It's really only a couple of sentences, but it's a starting point for a discussion. It's the announcement last week that Amazon CloudFront no longer charges for requests blocked by AWS WAF. So, John, thoughts on this?
Oh, I have some. So, yeah, this isn't a magic silver bullet. This isn't a panacea or anything like that. This is just AWS, I think, undoing a slight nasty part of their billing, which they should have done a long time ago, but it's good that they've eventually done it. So let's set some background. Let's set a bit of context. You have CloudFront set up. Maybe it's serving a public website off of your S3 bucket. Maybe you're using it as a CDN, whatever. You've followed AWS recommendations and best practice, and you've set the web application firewall, the WAF, and you've connected it to CloudFront, because the recommendation is you connect it at the edge. So that's CloudFront in this case, because that's the place where your requests go first, connect it to CloudFront. That way, you're not routing traffic through your world, paying for the data transfers and all the rest of it to then block it kind of further inside. Cool. Wonderful. If you had a malicious request, say it was a bot, say it was, someone trying to scrape an environment file, whatever, and your WAF blocked it, CloudFront, historically, would have charged you for that request, and WAF would have charged you for that request, and it would have charged you to block the request, because WAF you kind of pay for traffic inspection and then for rules if you've got more than a few of them, and so you start getting charged at various levels for this. This change removes one of those points of charging, just the one, the CloudFront one. So WAF is still going to charge you for inspecting the request and blocking the request, but if it has been blocked, CloudFront won't charge you your egress fees, because CloudFront doesn't charge you per request, it charges you based on the data. So you won't pay for the ingress egress out of CloudFront, but WAF is still going to charge you. So this is not massive, this is not amazing. You don't need to do anything to benefit from this change. It's just going to happen because it's a billing change, and that's just how they work. This is a nice thing to do, but it's not massive, and honestly, it's it's one of those parts of the billing model that just feels a bit predatory, if I'm honest, historically. Because if you had a whole flood of requests hit your CloudFront, say you're being denial of service or whatever, you'd be charged by CloudFront and you'd be charged by WAF. So it ends up, a denial of service ends up being a denial of wallet just through your AWS bill, which is just a bit nasty, if I'm honest. At least this way, you're not being double hit by AWS, as well as having an external problem to deal with. You're only paying the once. I do wonder, though, if this historic setup is just an artifact of the two pizza team that Amazon loves to wax lyrical about, and we all know that they work, because the services didn't really talk to each other particularly. You know, WAF was a service team, CloudFront had a service team, they had their own billing, and it all sort of did that. And now it appears that some product management type people have gone, hang on a minute, integrate them a bit better with the billing team and go, we really shouldn't be charging several times for this. So it's a nice cleanup. It's not a big change. It's not something that I'm going to go, well, hey, they've done this. This is amazing. It's just cool. Thanks very much.
I suspect probably customer feedback. Why are we paying for this twice? But who knows? What are your thoughts, Mohammed?
Yeah, I think that's not a big change, but one thing is like this update is automatically, applied to all CloudFront distribution using AWS WAF, but making it easy for the user to, get just benefit a little bit, even I can say, without needing to update their configurations on the application side. Yeah, I think this is auto applied by the AWS. So yeah, I think maybe this can be a little a benefit, in terms of improving security without added cost. So this update allow CloudFront user to maintain the robust security with AWS WAF without incurring extra fees for block requests. So yeah, in some terms, like it can be good for having when you have some malicious attacks and malicious traffic. So this can be if you high volume of unwanted traffic, malicious traffic. This can be the good to go.
Have you had any customers affected by this sort of thing where they've had to been stung on their bills by attacks?
Yeah, one of the client have they were mainly concerned about because it was healthcare data, and they were the hackers they were trying to send bunch of requests to try to get some data. So this is hectic because we can't do anything about it because this is out of the control. You can just try to block, okay, but there is a lot of solutions like you can do VPNs and a lot of other stuff, automations using even Python. You can burden on the traffic and send malicious attacks. So yeah, then it comes to the added cost. So I think that's a good step by the AWS.
Cool. A small step, but a good step in the right direction.
Yeah.
Anything that reduces cost is always very welcome. So moving on to our next article for this week. This is another feature announcement about Amazon Bedrock Prompt Management, which is now generally available. So it was announced earlier in the year into preview. It's now gone into general availability. So I'll give you an opportunity to speak first on this one, Mohammed. What are your thoughts? Have you had a play around with Bedrock yourself?
I was thinking to play around, but not yet. But I have seen a lot of content on LinkedIn. There are some AWS community heroes. They was creating some content using Amazon, Bedrock prompt. So the one example I see, they did just draw the architecture using paper and pencil, like architecture, and then they have just given this image to the Amazon, Bedrock prompt, via a file, and then it's given you the instructions how the infrastructure can be created, okay, outline, and then you ask for to create infrastructure using Terraform. And then you get complete infrastructure code based in Terraform easily. So I think in terms of utilization as a DevOps engineer, because sometimes most of the time I have to use Terraform to create infrastructure. So if you want to write the Terraform a lot of lines of codes, you can just get from Amazon Bedrock, just giving. Even you don't know how to give instructions, you can just draw a picture on your paper and just take a picture with your phone and just give this prompt, and it will give you a complete solution. I think that's amazing. I think it's added in AI. That's perfect.
Never really thought about image-based prompts. Usually when I think about prompts, I'm thinking text-based. But yeah, that's an interesting angle.
Yeah, we can add. I think this image was launched by last week. I was seeing a content. They added the text as well with the images. So the both solutions are, coming in a great way.
So, John, thoughts on this, and specifically around prompt management, I guess, which is what the feature that's being announced.
Yeah, so prompt management, part of the prompt engineering. I want to use the word discipline. I don't know if it is a discipline yet. I'm sure I'm going to tag Matt Carey in one of these and ask him, because he'd probably know, because it's kind of his bag. It's not really my bag. But the point here is, as we know, we've done some kind of AI processing bits for the podcast. So we run it through a step function that calls Bedrock a few times with a couple of prompts. I've kind of done prompt management, but I've used a DynamoDB table because it's what I knew. It was kind of free, serverless, stick it on paper, request, and don't really pay anything. Job done. So we run 4 prompts against the same input, right? This is a proper service for doing that, rather than a slightly janky Dynamo table and some loops. What is this doing? This is storing prompts for you. So you write the prompt ahead of time, which is, this is a podcast transcript with 3 people. Please give me a summary. Poof. That's a prompt. Wonderful. This lets you store those prompts properly in an actual managed service. Brilliant. Rather than janky tables. Why is that good? Well, it means that you just say, I want you to run this with prompt 1, bang. And then from the output of that, prompt 2, bang. So you can start to get this chain of thought prompting as well, which is the process where you give it a prompt, you take the output, you give it another prompt to refine the output, you take the output, you give it a third prompt to refine, and so on. So this is just starting to make that process a lot easier, because you're not having to send the whole prompt in every time. It's using stored prompt 1 and this bit. Give me a summary of this podcast transcript, please. So it's just making your code simpler, because rather than, like I say, going out to an external data provider like Dynamo or S3 or whatever to get your list of stored prompts and passing the whole damn string through, you just say, oh, look, here's your stored prompt, which is good for invoke model, which is kind of what we use it for. And it's also good for converse, which is how you start to do the chain of thought, because you're talking backwards and forwards. So I like this. I like this a lot. Hopefully, when I eventually get around to reworking how our step function works so it doesn't break all the time, I'll start using this.
Nice. Well, glad to see that Amazon are releasing features that you want to use. Yeah, I need to put my teeth in properly this morning.
What I'm going to have to do is, on the flight out to reInvent, because it's long enough, I'm going to have to pay for some Wi-Fi so I can play with these sorts of things, because that's the only time I'm going to get to do it.
Yeah, I don't know if airplane Wi-Fi is any good or not.
The last time I used it was 2016, I want to say, and it was okay, but it was expensive. I assume they use Starlink now.
Yeah, well, that's it. These things have improved. I have a friend who has Starlink. I went to stay at his house the other week, and his broadband was absolutely fine. So yeah, all good. So on that note, let's move along to our final article for this week, which is all about the latest earnings announcement from AWS. So the Q3 results were announced in the last week or two, and Amazon's AWS has recorded its highest profit margin in at least a decade. So great to see AWS still posting some very strong numbers, despite a lot of the noise that we see about cloud migration slowing down, people repatriating things from cloud, etc. That is not obviously borne out in these numbers that have come out of AWS. So, Mohammed, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think this is very consistent, revenue growth on AWS, 90% in the third quarter, making 5 consecutive quarter, year-over-year growth. And I think it's very, interesting, like AWS is growing year by year. And also, the storage demand for AI services, AWS artificial intelligence segments more than double in annualized revenue with the demand out, high demand with out capacity. So I think mainly due to the shortage, maybe in, as said in the article, the chip supply, according to the Amazon CEO. So I think, yeah, AWS leading the market, and remains the leader in the cloud infrastructure market. And based on the competitor like Google and Microsoft, so which is reported, like as we see 35% in the market, in the cloud unit especially. So I think, yeah, this is interesting. And which is as a community builder, you are also involved in AWS, and you're seeing this growth, I think, which is good.
John, thoughts?
It doesn't go against kind of the market noise, because a lot of the noise that you've been seeing in the trade press in the last couple of weeks has been around growth rates slowing down. Because if you look at the SaaS business growth rates from kind of 2021 to, they were stupid big. They were 40, 50, 60, 70%. And like the average was 45% growth or something insane. And, your average brick and mortar business would absolutely die for 40, 50% growth. We're not seeing huge amounts of revenue growth. We're seeing a bit, but what we're seeing is an uptick in the profit margin. What does that actually mean? It means that whilst AWS is reasonably committed to making our prices cheaper, they've kind of demonstrated this from one kind of generation of service to the next. They tend to get cheaper. They never say they get cheaper. What they tell you is you get better price to performance. So they don't always go down directly, but you get more compute for your money. But by and large, that means you get similar performance for less money, by and large. It turns out they're not passing all of those savings on to the consumer, which kind of, it makes sense. They're a business, they need profit, because we live in a capitalist hellscape. This is where we start talking politics, isn't it? And I'm going to move on from that very quickly. But it's the reality that we live in, right? So they are clearly running their data centers more and more efficiently, so they're costing them less to do in power, cooling, and all that jazz. So their profit margins are going up, which is, I suppose, good for Amazon staff, because as far as I understand, good parts of their compensation package is based on stock price. So I bet they're not complaining about that either. But yeah, it's interesting, because it's, we've seen big revenue growth numbers, and they've kind of slowed a bit. We've seen massive growth numbers generally within the businesses, and that's kind of slowed a bit as well. It's still growing, like 20% growth is still really good for businesses of this size. But the best profit margin for a decade is encouraging, and I think it starts to help put to bed the idea that this is all a flash in the pan. I'm sorry, they've been going for nearly 2 decades. They've just posted their best profit for a decade. They ain't going anywhere.
Dare we mention the layoffs? Obviously, that could have contributed. Well, will absolutely have contributed towards the profit margin.
Yeah, but the rounds that have just kind of happened, it depends, because I know there was some that happened like in the last couple of days, so that won't have affected these numbers, because this is like previous quarter. That will have affected it to an extent, sure, but yeah, that always makes me a bit uncomfy.
And you mentioned the share price there. If only we'd known Trump getting in would put all the share prices up. Would have been great to make some investments last week, wouldn't it? And but there we go. Hindsight is a wonderful thing. Anyway, on that note, before we get sucked into a conversation about American and global politics, I think it's time to wrap up Season 3, Episode 39 of Logicast. So thank you, John, as always, for your insights. And thank you, Mohammed, for joining us today. It's been great to meet you and to hear your insights as well. You mentioned you got your own YouTube channel. We'll put that in the show notes for anyone who's listening or watching and interested in checking out some of Mohammed's other content. And if you enjoyed the podcast, don't forget to like us, give us a review, tell your friends. We are available from wherever you download your podcasts. And if you'd like to see the faces that we're pulling when we're talking, we're also available on YouTube. So that's all for this week. Thanks for listening. We'll be back again next week with another episode, and we will see you again next time.